And welcome, everybody, to another episode of Primility Primer, our morning reminder of the power of balancing pride and humility as we go about our daily lives. This is episode number 54. I am your host, Jared Morris. And typically what we like to do here on Fridays is something called Primility Out in the Wild. So maybe in a blog post, in a podcast, on a TV show, in a conversation, just anywhere where something kind of catches my eye or maybe catches your eye and you've submitted it to me, or we just say, hey, that's kind of an example of primility there. And so my example today actually comes from a podcast from the James Altucher Show, which many of you have probably listened to. Some of you may have not. He does an interview show. It's a really smart interview show. And he did an episode with John McAfee. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because this guy has been in and out of the news. He's rather well known, somewhat notorious. If you have a Windows computer, you've probably used the McAfee security program, and that is kind of where he first became famous. He is a security expert. Also, he's very eccentric, and so we don't have enough time to get into all of that. But if you listen to this episode of the James Altucher Show with John McAfee, which I have linked at primility.com/show/054, or you can just search for James Altucher in your podcast player, you'll get a good, well-rounded taste of the very interesting and colorful life that this man has led. And I don't bring this subject here to the Primility Primer to judge him one way or the other and many things that he may have or may not have done throughout his life. But there are a couple reasons I'm bringing it here. Number one, this was recommended to me by a good friend who has a reputation for being kind of nervous about security, which is smart, which is something good to be nervous and cautious about. And if you don't have any such feelings, nervous about online security, privacy, you will or you should after you listen to this. And so I kind of want to recommend this episode as a bit of a public service just for everybody to listen to. And again, who knows if the extremes of what McAfee is talking about will ever actually come to fruition, if it's really that bad, but it's at least worth hearing. It's at least worth knowing. So just listen to that. He talks about, kind of what happens when you install free apps on your phone, different tracking. Just listen to it for that reason. I think you'll get a lot out of it for that. But what I want to talk about for today's episode of Primility Primer is kind of a discussion that they just happened to get into toward the end. It comes around the 43, 44 minute mark. And there's a bit of a contradiction there, but within that contradiction is an interesting example of primility, I think. And there are actually contradictions throughout this episode. Like McAfee talks about how you should never install a free app on your phone because they're getting some of these free apps are getting permissions to your actual camera, which is crazy. But basically, these free apps are kind of like Trojan horses sometimes. And yet he's pushing a free app of his own to help keep your phone secure. So this episode is interesting because there's a lot of kind of contradictions and ironies like that in there. And I thought this conversation that they have toward the end is a bit like that. So they talk about how James talks about how, nobody is perfect. And yet there's this expectation of perfection. And if people do anything wrong, especially on the internet, there can be this outrage that just erupts. And for people who don't live in the public eye, whose lives are not online, this isn't as much of a big deal. But still, I think just in general in our lives, we tend to judge and we tend to react. And so even whether it's an office, whether it's a family, when things go wrong, sometimes other people aren't understanding or are quick to judge. And so James asks John how he deals with that. And he basically says, look, none of us are perfect. And to quote him from this episode, he says, I don't deal with it one way or the other. I don't feel one way or the other. That's a problem with the person who has those feelings. If a person is angry at me with something I've done, that is their problem, which is interesting because on the one hand, I agree with him. And he talks about how his conscience is clean on a couple of these issues that James is referencing. And I think, look, if you've done something and if you are proud of it, if you're proud of the choice that you've made, then that's a perfectly fine way to feel. And that's a good sense of pride, right? And we can't judge our own actions. We can't judge our own decisions just because somebody else doesn't like them. But I also am not sure that I totally agree with if someone is angry at me with something I've done, that's their problem. it may well be your problem if the anger is well placed, if you have done something worthy of the anger. And that's where having the humility to step back and really analyze the situation, have the self-awareness to say, okay, did I do something that maybe I'm not that proud of? Did I do something that maybe I wouldn't want to do, that maybe I regret? And so it's an interesting statement, and it can be an empowering statement. This, if a person is angry at me or something I've done, that is their problem. But it can also be a self-defeating statement if we are so wrapped up in our own head that we don't recognize that, hey, there's a legitimate reason for the anger. And it's interesting because he basically contradicts himself in the very next statement that he makes in this same way. And so they move on a little bit to talk about judging character. And James asks John, do you have any kind of shortcut, or how can you shortcut having a good judge of character? And so here's what McAfee says. He says, trust people to be people. Trust humans to be human. All of us have anger and fear and doubt. We all judge, we all love, we all hope and have dreams. We're all the same, really. There's not a difference between any of us. If you put your trust in people, you put your trust in that which you know, which is that person will at some time be greedy, and at some time be resentful, and at some time angry, and at some time hurtful. So then if something happens, you can't blame them. You must blame yourself, which I think is him kind of giving the caveat that I gave earlier, that it's okay to say that is their problem. If you've really analyzed the situation, you don't think that you've done anything wrong. You're proud of what you've done, what you've said. And because of this person's, whatever it may be, prejudice, unwilling to really be understanding, unwilling to really think of it, then that can be okay. But on the other hand, we have to realize that people do that. People get angry. People judge. People jump to quick decisions. And so we can't just dismiss an opinion or a feeling that another person has simply because it doesn't match up with our expectation of what it should be. And so if we want other people to have patience with us, we at the same time have to have patience and understanding with them. So it's really interesting. And you hear it a lot where, people just say, well, I don't care. I don't worry about what other people think. And again, to a certain extent, I think that's okay. But it's like anything. The extremes tend to not work very well in the long run. They may be okay in a short term in a specific situation, but in the long run, it can really get us in trouble. And it can cause us, I think, to not treat other people the way that we should, or to get an inflated sense of self that we shouldn't have. And so but I love what he says about there's not a difference between any of us. And if you put your trust in people, you put your trust in that which you know. That person will be greedy at some point resentful, at some time angry, at some time hurtful. Let's all remember that. And let's understand that we aren't always going to have the emotional reactions or even the mental reactions that we want to have. And that's okay. If we have the self-awareness, we can step back, we can change it, and we can make amends. And at the same time, let's make sure that we have the humility to remember that for other people, so that we don't immediately dismiss someone's feelings just because they're angry or emotional, or that we don't, have this idea like, well, I don't care what other people think. I mean, if we go through our lives not caring what anybody else thinks, I get you can't care what just the random person that you don't know and who has no information thinks, but that can be a slippery slope if we take that into our interpersonal reactions and if we take that into our relationships. So an interesting example of Primility there. Again, go to primility.com/show/054. That episode of the James Altucher Show is about an hour long, but it's really, really interesting. There's some interesting stories in there. You may have heard about when McAfee was basically on the run in Belize, and just crazy stories. Definitely listen to it for the information on security and privacy. And the other interesting contradiction that's in there, I'll just say this before wrapping up, is they get into a discussion about mindfulness, basically, and about living in the present, and about not worrying about the future and not thinking about the past, and how the future hasn't happened, so why are we worrying about it? Yet the entire half hour preceding that was talking about security and how we should all be terrified about what people might do with our information in the future. So again, go into it understanding that there are many different contradictions, but frankly, that kind of makes the episode human in a way. That there are these contradictions. So because that's kind of just the essence of humanity, is that there are contradictions. And that's kind of how it goes. And we have to try and balance those contradictions. That ultimately is the essence of what we're talking about here at Primility. So thank you for joining me for this episode of Primility Primer. We have wrapped up another week of episodes. If you have missed any this week, make sure that you're on the email list, primility.com/join, because the Friday weekly digest will be coming out this morning. And that shows you the titles, the descriptions of all the episodes, so that you can make sure that you don't miss any that you wanted to listen to. I know it's hard to keep up with the daily show, so get on the email list, and then you also get the Monday morning email as well. Thank you for being here. Stay cognizant of your pride and humility as you go about your days this weekend. I'll be back Monday morning with another brand new episode. Wrist bump.